Good morning. We welcome you to the 11th and final meeting of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Education. I don't know that we've had this many meetings in the past, so this will be a great meeting. We've got some really good topics today, and if we will first start by taking the roll. So if the Secretary would please call the roll.
Assemblywoman Hanson. Senator Buck.
Here.
Senator Dondero Loop.
Here.
Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod.
Here.
Assemblywoman Hardy. Assemblywoman Miller.
Here.
Assemblywoman Thomas.
Here.
Chair Dennis.
Here, thank you. And please mark Assemblywoman Hardy and Assemblywoman Hanson as absent, excused. Unfortunately, our alternate member was also unable to attend in their presence. We originally were scheduled to meet yesterday, but because we didn't look at the calendar completely, we needed to make a change and to today, so that kind of facilitated them not being able to be here, but we appreciate all the work that they've done. All right, before we begin, I'd like to cover some housekeeping reminders. Set your electronic devices to silent. When speaking, make sure you identify yourself for the record each time you speak. And you have to turn the microphone on and off each time you finish speaking. And then sign in at the table if you haven't already, even if you don't plan to testify. The meeting materials received prior to the meeting have been uploaded to the committee's webpage. You can receive electronic notifications, agendas, minutes if you sign up on our website. And finally, note that during the committee meeting, the Zoom chat feature only used for technical assistance from our broadcast and production colleagues. With that, let's get started with public comment. Public comment may be provided in several ways, of all which are listed on the agenda. The first one is in person, here or in Carson City, via email, via written comments. Also, you can call in and participate. And so public comment is limited to 2 minutes per speaker. And you'll also have an additional opportunity at the end to give additional public comment. If you are calling in on Zoom, we'll have our production staff. They're going to interact with you to make sure that we can hear your testimony and be able to get you connected. So I'll begin first of all with the those wishing to make public comment here in Las Vegas. Anyone wishing to give public comment, if you just come forward. Good morning.
Not all at once.
And then you just have to push the button and identify yourself and then give your testimony.
Good morning, members of the commission. My name is Francesca Petrucci, and I represent the Clark County Education Association. CCA is the largest independent educators union in the state and the country. The Commission on School Funding came out of SB 543, which CCA has and will continue to support. We would like to see the committee's work continue into the legislative session, as their report will be used to spearhead a discussion around optimal levels of funding and educator pay. However, the challenge we face is not a lack of good ideas to improve our system. It's the political reality that could soon change in just 5 weeks. Whoever is elected is going to face the real challenge of tackling the myriad crisis we face, from vacancies to educator pay to safe working conditions. It is critical that whoever remains works in a bipartisan, strategic way, as that is the only way we accomplish monumental change. CCA cautions everyone in the danger of engaging in slogans that only serve as campaign fodder and neglect the inextricable link between our education delivery system and our economy. Slogans are easy. Legislation and outcomes require working together around sound and realistic goals. As we have done in the past, CCA will be aggressive in the next legislative session. We look forward to working with the legislators in both parties, in both houses, to advance and improve our public education system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wishing to give public comment here in Las Vegas? Go ahead. And if there's anybody else, you're welcome to come up. We've got several microphones there. So. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Lena Hovanesian on behalf of the Armenian community of Las Vegas and Nevada with the Armenian National Committee of America. I just want to say that it's a delight to see this bill come into the implementation stage. Our community greatly appreciates the inclusion of the Armenian genocide to combat denialism, historical accuracy, and to teach the next generation the truth about history so that it is never repeated. I just want to thank the entire state legislature and the Assembly and the Senate for ongoing support and anything that our community can do to continue to support the implementation of the initiative is always welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and appreciate all your work on getting this legislation through. Anyone else wishing to give public comment at this time here in Las Vegas? Okay, let's go up to Carson City. Anyone in Carson City wishing to give public comment? And you'll have to, some of you that are up there need to.
It doesn't appear
Just
so,
go ahead and
Chair
tell us.
Dennis.
Great. Thank you very much. No one's coming forward. How about anybody online? BPS, do we have anyone online to give public comment?
Thank you, Chair. To participate in public comment, please press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. Caller, please go ahead.
Good morning, Chris Daly, Nevada State Education Association, the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. Today you will hear a presentation on education funding topics and recommendations from representatives of the Commission on School Funding and the Nevada Department of Education. Since the introduction of SB 543 in 2019, NSD has expressed numerous policy concerns with the new funding formula, especially the fact that it contained no new revenue. In lieu of new funding, SB 543 created the Commission on School Funding, charged with recommending funding targets and identifying revenues to fully fund the associated costs. Over the past 3 years, the Commission has worked to identify the funding shortfall in Nevada schools. To reach optimal funding based on the recommendations of subject matter experts, Nevada would need to increase its per pupil spending by more than $5,000 today. To reach this goal with a phased approach, it would require an additional annual appropriation of $3.2 billion by 2032. This approach would include an annualized $256 million increase in 2023 and a $269 million increase in 2024, or $781 million for the next biennium. In April of 2021, the Commission published their preliminary recommendations. NSCA largely agreed with these recommendations and pointed out that it was incumbent on legislators to implement the plan you set in motion with the passage of the new funding formula. Later in the session, while some new revenue was passed, it did not significantly move the needle toward optimal funding. Instead, it prevented Nevada from falling further behind. As we head towards the release of the governor's proposed budget in the 2023 legislative session, it will become clear whether the work of the last 3 years was productive or another sideshow ordered by those looking to deflect responsibility and kick the can further down the road. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? BPSs, do we have anyone else?
Chair, the public line is open and working, but there are no additional callers at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to the next item on the agenda is item number 3, approval of the minutes for the meeting on August 9th and August 30th, 2022. Any questions or corrections? If not, I will take a motion.
Motion to approve the meeting minutes from August 9th and August 30th.
Thank you. So we have a motion from Vice Chair Bill Ray Axelrod, second from Senator Don Darrell Loop. Any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay or raise your hand. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. The motion passes. All right, let's go on to, and the minutes are approved. Let's go on to agenda item number 4, presentation on education funding topics and recommendations. We have with us Guy Hobbs, chairman of the Commission on School Funding. He previously had come and given us a report, and he has, and they've done a lot of work since then, and so we're going to get some additional input. And we also have Heidi Hartz from the Nevada Department of Education. So when you get set up and you're ready to go ahead.
Good morning. Again, I'm Guy Hobbs. I'm chairing the Commission on School Funding. I've had the privilege of being with you before. I didn't realize this was your last meeting, but congratulations on getting to that point. And now that we have this set up, I wanted to run through a few slides with you by way of background before we start talking about specific recommendations. Just for landscape, you all established the Commission on Education Funding in 2019 with SB 543 and charged it with certain roles and responsibilities. Those that remain at this point, as noted by some of the speakers during public comment, include identifying funding targets for optimal funding for education and a method of funding those targets over a 10-year period. That's what the Commission has been working on for the last many, many months, and I'll give you some summary information about where we are at this point. I think the most important thing in any initiative like this is quantifying the problem that you're trying to solve. And I know over many, many past legislative sessions, there have been a lot of different numbers floating around because of the way those things are calculated, sometimes with state money, sometimes with just local money, sometimes with or without federal grants, and it can become rather confusing to try to put your finger on exactly what the target funding elements are, and we've been working through that. And I think it would be beneficial to maybe cover some of that ground before we get to the specific recommendations, if that works okay, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you very much.
So one of the things that we did at the very beginning was trying to define what optimal funding meant. And optimal funding can be a bit elusive because differences of opinions may arise as to what's optimal in one area versus another. So one of the things that we did was looked at statistics that would depict what the national average funding is on a per pupil basis and likened those to what Nevada is currently spending on a per pupil basis. So on this particular chart, the 2020 section, the top half of it, are the most recent numbers that have been published. The national average spending per pupil, $13,489. Nevada's effort per the same source, $9,548, and we were able to validate that number through a review of the actual spending and budget numbers within Nevada. Subject matter expert recommendation, the state has used APA in the past as a consultant for funding education at a more appropriate and reasonable level than Nevada had in the past, and the number that you see for APA at $14,337 exceeds that of the national average, and that from a statistical perspective is rather important. Because one could, if you were just looking at the national average alone, There would still be some question as to whether or not, since you have variances both above and below averages, whether or not we would be at, below, or above the average. The APA numbers would strongly suggest that the national average would be on the low end, but it still serves as a reasonable metric. On the bottom half of that page, you'll see 2024 values, and although 2024 isn't here yet, we thought it important to inflate those values to 2024 because that would be the first fiscal year after your next legislative session, and that would be the commencement of the 10-year funding period that I mentioned earlier. Hopefully that all makes sense, that the funding plan that you all would hopefully be considering over the next 5 legislative sessions would span the fiscal year 2024 through fiscal year 2033. I'm sorry about the fact that this slide isn't as fancy as some of the others, because the report that we are required to file by November 15th is still a work in progress, and so I pulled this from the draft that I'm currently working on. But this chart represents statistics relative to the national average. And what you can see, and these numbers are inflated from 2024 forward to 2033 at 2% a year and with an assumption of 0.5% per year in growth in student enrollment. And the incremental shortfall is the amount of additional funding that would be needed each year over the course of that 10-year period. As you move to the aggregate shortfall, that's simply accumulating the numbers that you see in the left column. And you'll see that by 2033 rather, the amount of additional funding that would be required to achieve the national average would approximate $2.8 billion. Now, if you did all of that in 1 year, in 2024, it would be, as I might recall, about $2.3 billion if you were to do it in 1 year, but the plan was to look at it over a 10-year period, and that's why we have the incremental shortfalls shown. So those would be if one was staying on a linear trajectory to fully fund the identified target at national average, by the 10th year, the incremental shortfall would represent the linear amount needed each year to achieve that funding level. The adjusted shortfall number on the right recognizes that, excuse me, you all passed the mining tax bill. And for the first biennium, the mining tax was to go into the state's general fund. Beginning in fiscal 2024, the mining tax is to go to the benefit of the state education fund. And so we have adjusted the shortfall by $80 million per year. And you can see that when you get to the 10th year, in the aggregate shortfall column, you have $2,785,000, and in the adjusted shortfall column, you have $2,705,000. So that takes into account the fact that the mining tax would be coming into the state education fund. And again, this is all based on national average. This just graphically depicts what I've already spoken about, the amount needed each year on an incremental basis. So that would be the equivalent of new revenue required in each individual year. And on aggregate, the next chart that you see, by the time you get to 2033, again, nearly $2.8 billion in new funding for education to achieve the national average. Now, this next table goes to the APA recommended numbers, which you remember from the first chart that we looked at were then again larger than achieving the national average. So the number I would draw your attention to is in the middle column bottom number. To achieve the APA recommended levels at the 10th year would require $3.4 billion in additional funding. We've again adjusted that in the right-hand column to reflect the value of the mining tax. And it's still a very challenging value. So somewhere between $2 billion and a little over $3 billion by the 10th year to achieve either the national average or to achieve the APA recommended funding level. The next couple of charts, just simply take those numbers and depict them graphically, more as they'll appear in the final report, showing the annual funding challenge and then showing the aggregate funding challenge over that 10-year period. Now, there's another way we wanted to test these values because, again, they're very large, challenging values. And education is undeniably, if not the most important, one of the most important services that the state provides. So we realized that we needed to do a deeper dive on the range of values and what those might mean. We also are of the full understanding as members of the commission that the legislature would look at any amount of additional funding that it would be asked to provide and also look at and want to know what the probable return on that investment might be from year to year. So another exercise that we went through is we charged the Nevada Association of School Superintendents with the task of identifying if you got additional funding, how would you deploy that funding? And this is the result of that. And again, I apologize for this not being as fancy a chart, but this one is relatively new, but I think still very important. Priority 1, by the way, that you see on the left side, those are all of the costs associated with staffing, compensation, work conditions, the human capital part of education. I know that we've spoken in the past, and I know that you've spoken in the past about some of the problems that education currently faces with its ability to fill authorized positions that are still vacant at this time. And the fact that you're competing in a market that is not only within Nevada, it's within the Southwest, it's within the entire United States. And it's extraordinarily important that Nevada positions itself to be able to attract, and once they attract, retain professional staff to provide the actual instruction that goes on within education. And per the superintendents of the various school districts, this was an identified amount that included all of those different facets, and we'll go into that in deeper detail when we issue the report. Priority 2 is fully funding the weights and other items like work-based learning and those sorts of things. In the report and through the work of APA, we were able to identify the amount per student that we're currently funding for things like English language learners, at-risk students, special education, and gifted and talented students. And in all cases other than one, there is a significant gap between the identified amount required to fully fund those weights and the amount of current funding. And to fully fund those weights, that's essentially what priority 2 is. Priority 3 deals more with mental health aspects, after-school programs, those types of things that would position a student for a better outcome. And when you add all of those together, you see the totals on the bottom line. In 2022 dollars at $3.7 billion, and in 2033 dollars at $4.5 billion. And if you compare that to the charts that we just went over, the national average at 2033 was $2.8 billion. The APA recommended values were $3.4 billion, and those recommended by the Nevada Association of School Superintendents at $4.5 billion. And I think the main point I'd like to make about all of those values, because you essentially have this spread between 2 and 4.5 billion. I think it gives dramatic context to the national average values and whether or not the national average understates Nevada's position relative to its peers around the country. It's certainly our conclusion that the national average would be on the low end of funding for education in Nevada and would not achieve optimal funding. But I think it's important for you all to have all 3 of these targets to be able to compare and contrast. So the foregoing, I mean, everything I've talked about up to this point addresses the questions that have been posed in SB 543 and AB 495 in 2021, that what the funding targets are to achieve optimal funding under three different metrics: the national average, APA, and those numbers according to the Nevada Association of School Superintendents. The second directive that was given to the commission was to identify how these targets may be funded over the ensuing 10 years. And I think it's important to once again emphasize the fact that the legislature, and I would say this quite confidently, in its wisdom, provided for a 10-year funding plan. If you look at the size and consider the size of the numbers that we've been talking about relative to the size of the state's budget, it's obviously a very challenging thing to accomplish. To try to accomplish it in a single year or a single legislative session, I would say would be next to impossible to do. But if one were to set forth a plan, and in particular, give some meaning and credence to the values that have been identified as funding targets, I think it serves you well in terms of identifying what the targets are over a 10-year period, and it would provide you the ability on a biennial basis to assess levels of compliance with the targets that have previously been identified. So I think it gives you a method of measuring progress in achieving the eventual goals. And it gives you a longer period of time to phase in some of the changes that may be required to achieve these funding levels. So I think, and I hate to be redundant about it, but I do enough of this kind of work that one thing that is extraordinarily important when you're dealing with something like this is fully establishing and accepting the challenge that you're dealing with. And in this case, we've quantified that for you. I don't believe that those numbers are terribly debatable, and that's one of the reasons why we tried to show it in a number of different ways, again, to bring context and validity to the national average, and whether or not that means something, we believe it certainly does by virtue of the comparison with APA and with the Nevada Association of School Superintendents, which would seem to suggest, again, that that's on the low end of the continuum. And one other thing that we did, just to provide you some additional assurance, there's oftentimes when you bring up numbers about funding on a per pupil basis, and you have different sources, one of the first lines of questioning you go through is, well, wait a minute, does that one include capital? Does that one include debt service? Does that include transportation? Does it, so on and so forth. One of the things that we've done here is to try to put them on a pure apples to apples basis, so there is not as much opportunity for that debate in the future. And we spent a considerable amount of time doing that. So hopefully these present themselves as meaningful targets to you and something to work toward in the future. That is a blank slide, because now we get to the really, really fun part. And I'll talk a little bit about what the commission has been doing. And as I mentioned to you earlier, this is still a work in progress. Our due date for the report is November 15th. I still work on this report nearly daily in terms of trying to work through the quantification of some of the methods of funding that will be identified in the report for your consideration. The commission will not be identifying one method of funding. The commission will be identifying a multitude of things that could be looked at by the legislature over time to help make progress toward achieving these goals. Because we realize that there's a lot of give and take with these, and there'll be, certainly a lot of different viewpoints about what is the best way to move forward. But I wanted to start with an example on the property tax side. I bring up property tax with a lot of hesitation because after working in public finance in Nevada for 40 years, I realize the visceral reaction that occurs when property tax is discussed. I have been on the receiving side of a lot of that visceral reaction over the years. That's one of the beautiful things about being in this position of bringing these kinds of things forward. And I have that full understanding. But I raise it because it's an unavoidable topic. Property tax has been, in Nevada, a traditional and historical method of funding education for many, many, many decades. It is the primary source of funding education for all state school systems around the country. It is part of our DNA, essentially, in terms of how education is funded. So to not discuss it would be a dramatic oversight. And some things have happened over the years to diminish the effectiveness of property tax as a funding source for education. Now, when those things happened, it certainly wasn't with the thought in mind that, hey, in doing this, we're probably going to affect the future ability of education to be fully funded. No, there were other things that were issues at the time that caused some of these things to happen. But here I wanted to give an example of something that I think is a primary issue. This shows you what if we raised the property tax by 1 cent, 1 penny per $100 of assessed valuation, which is a rather modest increase, on a statewide basis, what the annual revenue would be from just simply raising it by 1 penny. And you can see by 2033, that would raise a modest, compared to the numbers that we're looking at for education, $27 million. However, when one applies the existing abatements to a penny of property tax, you turn what was $27.6 million in actual revenue into $7.7 million. And that raises the issue of the abatements and their effect on the actual raising of revenue. We know why the abatements are in place. They're in place to restrict the amount of growth in property tax bills from year to year. And that in and of itself seems to be a very good thing. But does it have another effect? Yes, it does have another effect. It mutes the ability to actually generate the revenue that would otherwise be taxable. This is another way of looking at it. Inflation-adjusted per capita property tax revenue. It's a heck of a title, but this is a terribly meaningful statistic. Inflation-adjusted means it's in current dollars all the way across, so they're comparable from year to year. And it's done on a per capita basis to take into account growth. And I've always felt in many, many years of working in public finance that inflation-adjusted per capita is an extraordinarily valuable measure to look at. It tells you per person how much real money would be raised each year. And you know on the other side of the equation, when you get to the expense side, the service side, that things are also measured in service per unit. You're providing service to people. So per capita makes a great deal of sense to look at. And what this tells you, net of abatements means this is after the abatements have been applied. And you see after 2011, we started falling below the long run average, and we were well below the peak. And we've only recovered to a point we're estimating in 2023 that's roughly equivalent to the per capita revenue that we were generating 12 years ago. That's amazing when you think about that level of non-growth in one of the staple revenue sources you have to fund education and other services in the state, that it's roughly equivalent to what you were raising in 2011. And that, in my mind, is a pretty good depiction of what the abatements have done to the revenue raising side. There's another factor on the property tax side that I know that many of you have heard about, particularly those that have served on the taxation committees or revenue committees, as they may be called, and that's the notion of depreciation. We are the only state, and I suppose this is something to be proud of, We're the only state in the country that depreciates assessed valuation. And essentially what that means, let me back up for a moment. When we assess a piece of property for taxation, we look at the full cash value of the land. Fair enough. But for the improvements that sit on that land, we look at the replacement value of those improvements, not the market value, number one. Number two, we take those replacement values and we depreciate them by 1.5% a year, down to a residual of 25% of replacement value. So if a property, and that's what this is intended to show on the far right side, at the 50th year of the aging of the improvements, only 25% of the replacement value of the improvements is added to the land value. So when you contrast that with market value, there's an extraordinary spread between market value and taxable and assessed value. Now, that there was probably good intentions behind depreciation when it was first put into play. I think some of the thinking all of those years ago was that, well, it's a good thing for longer term residents that are within their property to accrue a little bit of a break or a governor on their growth in property taxes, but people don't stay in the same homes for 50 years, generally speaking. It's also a very complicated thing to administer because when you think about properties like commercial properties, say along the Strip, for example, there are parts of the building that may be 50 years old, there are parts of the building that may be 40 years old, there are parts of the building that may be 30 years old, and parts that are brand new. It's a rather convoluted thing to do, and again, we're the only ones that believe it's wise to do this. But a note to make about, I think I have another one that shows here a bit more of that spread. So if you started in year one with a home that had, or a property that had $100,000 worth of replacement value improvements on it, over time, the value of that you would think would grow. And on the bottom line, we're showing what the growth of that would be with no depreciation. So by year 50, that would be worth $438,000, yet would be taxed at $110,000. And again, this isn't necessarily to say that there were bad intentions. I don't believe there were. I believe they were very good. But what has that led to? It's led to an extraordinarily large gap between taxable value and market value for whatever that may be worth. And I think that confuses a lot of people. I know I get a lot of questions every year from friends of mine that know that I somehow enjoy looking at these things, right? And I got a number of them in the past, say 3 or 4 months, when the issue of the 3 and 8% abatement came up. You know, what's going on with this? You know, why is this one at 3%, one at 8? And, you know, I tried to explain it as simply as possible, and of course that's an impossible thing to do. 3% for owner-occupied, that's the way that one works. Anything that isn't an owner-occupied residential unit is 8%. That's the simplest I've been able to describe that. And that's the sum and substance of the abatements. But one of the reasons I bring both of these up to you is, you know, we looked at depreciation, and one of the questions that we asked ourselves, if we were to do something to modify depreciation, would we actually be able to gain revenue from doing that? And the answer is only modestly so, which defies logic. The reason why it's only modestly so is because of the abatements. The combination of the abatements with depreciation act as like a double brake on the ability to generate revenue. And I'll come back to those in a minute. I wanted to give you that background as rationale for one of the reasons why some of our recommendations may have to do with the property tax side. And one other point I'd like to make to you before I shouldn't have jumped ahead as quickly as I had here to the sales and use tax side of things. But I think if I were in your position, I would look at some of these opportunities on the property tax side, and we'll talk about sales tax here in a moment, as opportunities for fiscal modernization within the state. You know, depreciation's been with us for a long time. I don't believe that the reasons that it was originally put in place are valid anymore. Abatements have only been with us for the last, say, 15 or so years. That's a relatively new thing. While it has had some benefit on one side, it certainly created some opportunity cost or loss on the other side. And there's an opportunity to reevaluate the fiscal system and over a period of time modernize it and bring it up to date. And by doing so, you may be able to create revenue opportunities to help fund education as well. And that's really the rationale. And even if we weren't looking at this as an education funding issue, I would sincerely recommend that property tax be looked at, depreciation, assessment methodology, the 35% taxable to assessed ratio, the abatements, all of those things be reviewed for updating and modernization and to make them more efficient and effective on their own face. Now, the second one that is a traditional source of funding education in the state of Nevada is sales tax. The local school support tax is one component of sales tax that goes directly to will go directly to the state education fund. And also there's 2% that goes directly to the state's general fund. The general fund also helps fund education, as you all realize. And one of the things that has become very apparent over the last many, many years is that the sales tax base against which we apply the sales tax rates began as a very narrow base. And over time, it has become more narrow. What are the reasons for that? Our Constitution defines a taxable sale as something that's sold at retail and is tangible. That's in the Constitution. So if you think about commerce that takes place that involves something that's not a tangible item or sold at retail, there is no sales tax applied to that. I refer to those as implicit exemptions because it's implied that they will not be taxed. Now, to those things that remain that are sold at retail and are tangible items, throughout the NRS, there are a number of very specific explicit exemptions. The more widely known ones are, groceries purchased at a grocery store. When you fill up your gas tank, that's fuel tax, not sales tax, prescriptions. And over time, a couple of things have happened. One, through technology, more items have become intangible over the years. We used to be 2/3 tangible, 1/3 intangible, say 50 years ago. It's reversed today. So that part, technology has actually diminished this base to an extent. And on the other side, we have explicit exemptions that have either been put into place directly by the legislature, and again, for good reason in many of those cases, and those that have been voted on. You might recall just a few years ago, there were a couple of other items added to the explicit exemption list. And over time, when you do that, the tendency is to make your base more and more narrow. And as that base gets more narrow over time, a couple of things happen. And this one became very, very apparent as we were charting the monthly numbers during COVID, for example. In Clark County, to use Clark County as an example, the largest area of trade that produces sales tax revenue is eating and drinking establishments, produces a little over 19% of the total sales tax. So as we shut down for a period of time, 20% of it essentially went away. That was a very stark and dramatic example of how that can work when you have such a narrow base and are so heavily reliant upon certain areas of trade to perform well year in and year out. In the northern part of the state, the number one producer of sales tax revenue was the sale of motor vehicles. And that had sort of a weird inverse effect during COVID, when people were buying cars like crazy, which again, at the beginning of all of this, it defied logic, and then part of it made sense to us. The automotive industry was offering 0% interest for 84 months, and the federal government was providing a stimulus that in many cases became a down payment on a vehicle. But the economies are not the same from county to county, and there is heavy reliance on certain areas of trade performing well from year to year. The narrower your base is, the more subject you are to volatility if any of those areas of trade run into a problem. So this chart was to give you an example, and this is something the commission also looked at. What are some things that are taxable under sales and use tax in other states that we do not tax in Nevada? And we just thought it would be interesting to look at what some of those things are. And you can see that, for example, up at the top, you have things like cellular telephone services. 43 of the other states apply a sales and use tax to that. Nevada does not. Now, that isn't to say that Nevada doesn't assess anything against cellular telephone services. It assesses franchise fees in many cases for some of these items. But again, as you work your way down this list, some of these are very large areas of trade that are either implicitly or explicitly exempted in Nevada. And that is something that can help initiate a discussion of opportunity to broaden the base. It's important for me to say one other thing that is horrifically boring, I suppose, but because of the way that our Constitution is written, if we were to tax items that are intangible under the sales and use tax, that would probably be inappropriate and contrary to the way the Constitution is drafted. That doesn't make it an impediment, however, because one can assess a transaction excise tax against those items that mimics the sales tax. And that would be a very simple way of doing that. Because we really enjoy inflation-adjusted per capita statistics, I thought we would do the same thing with inflation-adjusted per capita taxable sales. And you can see how that's performed over time, which, again, speaks, I think, to the volatility discussion we were having a moment ago. After the Great Recession, toward the peak that you see in the middle was followed by the Great Recession, and you see what happened to taxable sales. It became very exposed. Once again, our per capita taxable sales are only returning to a value that was in place around 2007 or so. And that, to me, represents a weakness in the revenue-producing capability of this particular source of revenue. Now, I put this chart in there, and this is way too busy to go over in a meeting like this. But one of the things that we then decided to evaluate is what are some of these other areas of trade that we are not currently assessing with a sales-type excise tax. How much taxable sales would they possibly produce, and what would the revenue yield be if we applied a rate of, and you can see on the left side, the vertical axis. We have it in tenths of a percent all the way up to 6.85%, which is the state base rate that's common to all counties in the state. And just to give you an example, at $10 billion of additional area of trade, if one assessed 6.85% against it, it would produce $685 million. It has potent capability to generate additional revenue. There's no question about it. And it doesn't have to just simply be viewed on the rate side. I tend to believe, and I've believed for 20 or 30 years, that the base side needs equal attention as the rate side. And sometimes it's easier to look at the base side from a standpoint of equity. And what I mean by equity is you have, of our overall commerce in the state, 65% of the commerce in the state is not subject to a thing like a sales tax. So that leaves you 35% that is. If you happen to be a business that sells tangible goods that aren't otherwise exempt, you have to work that into your pricing strategy for your products. If you happen to be part of the 65% that doesn't have that, you do not have that, that particular issue to deal with and can price differently. So there is an element of equity that goes along with all of this as well. And so we pulled out a few to take a look at just to give a sense of order of magnitude of how much activity occurs each year in different areas of trade. And I'm going to focus on a couple of these because they're rather simple. And they match up to that matrix that we looked at a moment ago. If you picked on the right side, number 13, personal care, generates $5.8 billion a year in economic activity. And one other reason for maybe circling personal care to talk about for a moment is when you're talking about things like sales tax, the last thing you want to do is ever talk about applying it to areas that are necessities of life. If it applies to necessities of life, it is highly regressive. If it's to discretionary items, it's certainly less so regressive. The other one I would look at is item number 9, recreation at $4.2 billion. The nice thing about those two together is if you add them together, they equal $10 billion in economic activity each year. Both would appear to be more discretionary than not. And again, these are just examples. This is not a recommendation. It's just to illustrate to you whether or not something like this is possible, because that's one of the first things we wanted to test is whether it's possible before we then in turn made any recommendations to you all. So those two together, $10 billion, you can go back to that matrix and see if you applied a rate against it, what the level of revenue production might be at rates all the way up to 6.85%. And given the numbers that we're talking about, could this potentially be a contributor to a solution for education funding? Our feeling is it absolutely could be a contributor. This is probably the best slide of all because it's the last one. But I did want to take a moment to also go over with you then, what are we recommending to all of you? One of the first recommendations we would make to the legislature through your committee, the Commission on School Funding, we believe, has served a reasonably valuable purpose to the legislature. At least we would hope so, both in validating and working through the implementation issues associated with the pupil-centered funding plan, which have been accomplished. And that is now in place, and we believe that that will serve Nevada very well. But in also identifying funding, we believe that maintaining the pupil-centered funding plan model is of exceptional importance going forward, and believe that the Commission on School Funding, and this is actually our second recommendation, jointly maintain the pupil-centered funding plan model with the Nevada Department of Education and continue to provide over time recommendations for improvement to the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan. That's not something that gets maintained for once and for all in one interim. It's something that constantly has to be reviewed to make sure it's performing well. So our first two recommendations would be that you continue the Commission on School Funding, hopefully with appropriate resources to perform its work, and that the pupil-centered funding plan model be jointly maintained by the Nevada Department of Education and the Commission on School Funding. Another thing that the Commission on School Funding could provide assistance to the legislature with would be the ongoing implementation of a funding plan to achieve the target values that we've identified. We are certainly ready, willing, and able, not that I will be there for 10 years of this, but ready, willing, and able to provide that assistance and support to the legislature wherever it may be requested or needed. The third recommendation is one that we've already spoken a bit about, that the values that have been identified as the target values, we strongly believe that the legislature in some form or fashion should adopt, accept, I'm not sure what the right word is, acknowledge that these values are real and that they should be continued to be used as a measuring stick for progress toward the funding goals over the 10-year period. Again, pointing back to many past legislative sessions where there were discussions about, well, what really is the funding need? What really is the funding target? One can get lost in arguing about the numbers that form up the target as much as they can in devising a solution for it. And we believe that we have worked through those numbers and provided you with something that is reliable, fair, and reasonable as far as a measurement of what the funding target should be. The fourth recommendation has really less to do with the operation of schools than a recognition as we went through this that some of the smaller school districts around the state truly struggle with another part of funding for education, and that's the ability to maintain pace with capital needs, and particularly facilities. Now, we haven't included capital in this because capital is generally presumed for schools to be more of a local issue than it is a state issue, and I can fully respect that. However, you have a lot of school districts that are within counties that are at the $3.66 property tax cap and have virtually no room to even go out with a ballot question to ask the voters if they would wish to do something to improve capital. And I've talked to enough of, that's one of the things over the last 3 years is I've had an opportunity to meet people from these other school districts and talk to them about things like facility challenges and technology challenges and rolling stock and all those kinds of things. And they are not all in the same type of shape that I think we would like them to be. And so that's something that we would like to see the legislature also address. I've thought of a few things that, perhaps might be worth consideration there, like the state started a state infrastructure bank and funded it for the first time through the Treasurer's office this past year. The state infrastructure bank may offer an opportunity to do lower cost borrowing, for example, or a state revolving fund. But it's something else that needs to be addressed on a going forward basis. Part and parcel to recommending additional funding is, and this would be a fifth recommendation, that the legislature and the Commission on School Funding would certainly be happy to assist in any regard with this recommendation, but that the legislature create performance metrics to gauge the return on investment for continuing investment in education. If I were in your position, this is something that would be extraordinarily important to me, that as we're developing new funding sources to apply to education, I certainly would want to be sure that they're being applied to their highest and best use and providing a return over time. And I suppose that this has been talked about as the accountability issue in past years, but the notion of having performance metrics on both sides, both the funding side and the application side by each of the school districts, I believe should be hand in hand. Number 6, and I think this was touched on a little bit earlier, it became very apparent to us that one of the more challenging areas these days in funding education is dealing with the human capital side of education. We have a number of vacancies, I believe well over 1,000 in Clark County alone, and probably closer to 2,500 or maybe 3,000 in the state that are authorized to be filled, but we're unable to fill them because we can't attract enough teachers and other professionals to fill those positions. That's a problem going forward. Because even if the funding were there, if you're unable to attract the human capital to provide the service, I don't know that you've gained very much. And so we believe that further study should be done on both the, I guess a way of referring to it would be the educator pipeline. In the state of Nevada, are we producing enough units of professional educators to fulfill the need that we have each year? I believe the answer to that is no. If we're not doing that, have we positioned ourselves from a compensation standpoint to be able to attract and compete within the region and nationally? And I believe the answer would suggest that we're not at that point yet. So we believe that's an area that requires additional study. And of course, as I touched on with you, a strong recommendation would be to consider modernization and updating of the sales and property tax systems in the state of Nevada as traditional and historic funding sources for education. Both are in need of attention, just from a fiscal policy perspective, but both offer a remarkable opportunity to raise additional revenues over time. Now, a number of our recommendations, the more granular recommendations, will come under this particular category. We are looking at abatements, depreciation, looking at phasing them out, readjusting them, and what the value of that might be from a revenue production standpoint over time. So our report will contain a number of those for you to review. It will contain a number of other areas that we're also exploring. You know, is there a possibility that you could take something like the school operating rate, which is 75 cents of the overall combined property tax rate, and exempt that from abatement over time to allow it to generate additional revenue as it was intended to do from the very beginning. So there are probably 11 different topics that I expect we will touch on under the property tax category, and at least 3 under the sales tax category that have to do more with the base than with rate, much as I've spoken with you today about. The 8th recommendation it's less a recommendation than it is an acknowledgement. In SB 543, again, in the legislature's wisdom, they included something that recognized that the Economic Forum each year will estimate the amount of revenue that will be available for the subsequent biennium. You all are very familiar with that, and they'll be doing that at the end of this calendar year. So it's not something that we could necessarily include in a report that's going to be filed in, 5 weeks because it hasn't happened yet. But if the Economic Forum projects an increase in revenues that's over a certain level, a commensurate increase in education funding per SB 543 is supposed to take place unless it's found not to be practicable. I believe that's the word that's used in SB 543. So we're just urging that once the Economic Forum makes its recommendations, that this part of SB 543 hopefully will be found to be practicable. And much like the mining tax, that would adjust the values that you saw in those earlier tables in a downward way. And we think that would also be very positive to do. I know I've gone over a lot with you in a very short period of time, and I really, really appreciate your indulgence. These are topics I could literally talk about, like, do you have until like 7:30 or 8 o'clock tonight? Because we've spent that much time and detail on them, but I hope I've given you enough of a summary to give you a preview without completely wrecking the impact of the final report, right? Of what the final report will include by way of recommendations and more importantly, the justification for those recommendations. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments or anything else you all may have.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank you. When we talk about all of these different topics, even on the revenue, and I've been part of the revenue committee, and this has a lot of information that we talk about, but it's concise. So it's a really good way to look at how some of these impact. So I really appreciate the way you put that together. Appreciate all the work that you've done. With that, do we have questions? Assemblywoman or Vice Chair Bill Axelrod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hobbs, so much for being here. That was absolutely fascinating, and I have a million questions, but I'm going to just take something right off the tops just so I can wrap my head around this. one of your last slides that talks about the service-related categories in total sales, and you pulled out two things, personal care and recreation. And I was just wondering, you said the term, I forgot how you said it, about something like life needed, what, I don't remember what you said, but could you give me an example of that and then an example of what you're suggesting so I can kind of understand this too?
Sure. Guy Hobbs, once again, I appreciate the question because nothing is as simple as what I tried to make it sound today. Within the area of personal care are probably hundreds of individual items, and some you would find to be non-starters. For example, one of the areas under personal care is death-related services. That's not one that anybody would recommend that you change the taxability of. Anything that's medical would fall into that category. Something that you do by choice, not because of necessity of life or it's needed for a child or it's needed to maintain a reasonable quality of life, should be included in anything where there may be an additional transaction-oriented excise tax applied to it, because again, that creates very real arguments of regressivity, and that's something we would not want to do. But there are a number of other examples under things like personal care that are choices. The number of times, and I don't like to say this, I realize that we have members that may be more sensitive to things like this, but the number of times one may choose to go to get a massage or hair appointments or things along those lines are more a matter of discretion than they are necessity. And clearly, if we were going to look at something like personal care, we would have to go through it on a granular basis to make sure there was comfort with it. And the same thing on the recreation side. That one may be more apparent that most of the things that are done under a recreation category, and these are just two examples, most of the things that are done under a recreation category are by choice, not by necessity. One of the other examples I can give you, I didn't really speak a lot about it, but you might remember from that one chart we had earlier of things that are not taxed in Nevada that are taxed elsewhere. There's a number of those that have the word digital in front of them, right? And I think this is an important distinction to make. It's one of the best examples we can give as to why this needs to be looked at from a tax policy perspective as much as it does from a revenue generating perspective. I guess they're the old days now, but you used to go to some place like Barnes & Noble to buy a book, if those even exist anymore. Today you download it. When you bought the book at Barnes & Noble, you paid a sales tax. When you download it, you do not. It's the same item, right? Same thing would be true with something like going to a record store, if any of those exist anymore, and buying a CD, taxable, downloading it, non-taxable. And you can go on and on with examples like that. What that creates is that's undermining your base, right? Because you have items that were taxable that by no action on your part or anybody else's part are now non-taxable because they're intangible. That's something we refer to as economic leakage. And by plugging that leakage, you would generate additional revenue. And again, those are just some examples. And I realize, and my very, very dear friend, Carol Villardo, who I miss tremendously, would say these words if she were sitting right here. The devil is in the details. I think I heard her say that over 100 times. But that's truly the case. I believe that opportunity exists to evaluate these, but there are some parts of it that you would not find to be good candidates, and others you might find to be better candidates.
You still have 999,000 questions.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, Senator Dondarrow.
Thank you. I kind of have a two-parter. Back to what Vice Chair ask, what's under education? What would be some of the things in that type of a category?
To be honest, Guy Hobbs again. To be honest, I would need to go back and look at the actual detailed reports, but off the top of my head, I would think it would be things like classes and programs that people sign up for that are not part of the K through 12 or higher education system.
Just because we're an education committee, I thought I'd ask that. And then the second thing is under recommendations, the 8 recommendations that you gave, are those, is that anywhere in print or can we get that? I took what I think is copious notes, but I always worry about what you hear and what you write.
Guy Hobbs once again. At the last meeting, which was the last meeting of the Commission on School Funding a couple of weeks ago, I went over those 8 recommendations in some detail, so that should be on the record. And
I will find that.
We should be able to pull that for you, and hopefully in a more complete way than I summarized them for you today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Other questions? Just one real quick clarification for me. When you mentioned when you were giving us the pre-information on the property tax, let's see if I can find my notes. You talked about how we give the abatements. Oh, no, it was the depreciation. On the depreciation, yeah, I don't know what page this is. The one that says property taxes in Nevada depreciation. I just wanted to clarify that when it says on there year 0, year 50, that's the date that it was constructed as opposed to how long somebody, because it could have had multiple owners. It was built, whenever. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Guy Hobbs, once again, that's absolutely correct. The depreciation stays with the property. It has nothing to do with the ownership. So, year 0 is probably more like really year 1. And in the very first year, it's the full cost of replacement value, and then it starts to be depreciated for 50 years.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? All right.
I just also, I failed to acknowledge that one of our members of the Commission on School Funding is with us today in the audience, and I know that it was your loss. It was our gain to have her join the Commission on School Funding, but I certainly wanted to acknowledge Senator Woodhouse. She obviously, along with you, Mr. Chairman, had a great deal to do with the promulgation of SB 543, the existence of the Commission, and now she's a living part of the Commission, and we're very appreciative to have her.
Thank you very much. So if we have no further questions, that's I think what I want to do, because there were some recommendations made and we might want to make some recommendations, but we need to give our staff just a couple of minutes to think about that. I want to take how much time do we need? Okay, let's take a 10-minute break because we only have these 2 items today, and if we do have some recommendations that we would like to make, we have to do that at this point in the meeting. So, with that, we will be on a 10-minute break. We are on recess. Okay, we are back from recess. We'll continue. So what I'm going to do is because there were some recommendations that they had talked about, that Chair Hobbs talked about, that I wanted to make sure our staff understood what those were, and then had legal look in case we want to make some recommendations. So I'm going to have Ms. Sturm kind of recap what we heard, and then I'll have the Chair Hobbs just make sure that that's accurate, and then I'm going to have legal talk about some issues there. So, Ms. Sturm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jen Sturm, Committee Policy Analyst. As nonpartisan staff, we neither advocate for or against any measure. So the recommendations proposed by Chair Hobbs included, 1, the Commission on School Funding recommends that the legislature extend the life of the commission to continue its work in improving the implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan, or PCFP, and assisting with the implementation of a funding strategy to meet the objectives set forth in SB 543. The commission further recommends the commission to be provided with sufficient resources to support its mission. Number 2, related to the first recommendation, the Commission also recommends that responsibility for the maintenance of the model that drives PCFP be vested jointly with the Commission and the Nevada's Department of Education. 3, the Commission on School Funding recommends that the legislature adopt the target values for both achievement of the national average per pupil spending and recommended level of per pupil spending described in the report as the standards that should be achieved by the 2032 to 33 biennium. These target values aimed at achievement of performance goals and standards for education would serve as a gauge against which progress over the next 5 biennia can be measured. Number 4, the Commission on School Funding recommends that the legislature create a pathway for smaller school districts to acquire capital and engage in building improvement and modernization programs that are otherwise unavailable to these districts. This may take the form of the creation of a revolving fund to extend loans to smaller districts, additional funding to the State Infrastructure Bank for the expansion of lending program, or the use of a state bond bank. Number 5, the Commission recommends that the legislature direct the creation of performance metrics to assess the impact of enhanced investment in K-12 education. These metrics would provide a foundation for measuring the return on added investment as envisioned by SB 543, AB 495, and is recommended in the report. Any increased investment should be accompanied by a system of accountability for the effective use of the additional investment. Number 6, the Commission recommends the legislature study the imbalance between number of professional educators matriculating from institutions of higher education in the state and the number of new units of professional educators demanded each year by school districts in the state. This would be coupled with a classification and compensation review for professional educators and support personnel to determine whether insufficient compensation is contributing to the difficulty in attracting and retaining these positions. This would provide additional foundation for determining the cost association with the achievement of the state's class size mandates over the 10-year funding horizon. Number 7, the Commission recommends the legislature consider modernization of both the Nevada sales and use tax and Nevada property tax systems as the primary and traditional funding sources for state services, and specifically for the funding of K-12 education. And since significant capacity exists within both of these systems of taxation, it is further recommended that the roster of recommendations in this report, specifically those enumerated in the property tax and sales tax sections, be considered as a menu of funding options to achieve the identified funding needs by fiscal year 2033. These recommendations meet the mandate given to the Commission on School Funding to identify methods of funding, while also providing the legislature with a series of choices that can be used in combination to achieve the desired results. And finally, number 8, the Commission recommends that upon the release of the Economic Forum estimates, the state general fund appropriations to education be increased in a manner consistent with the formula and direction established in SB 543. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hobbs, would you just confirm that sounds, that's basically, these are, and I know you guys are still working on these to finalize them, but since this is our last meeting, if we as a committee want to make recommendations, I want to at least have some of these out there so that we can talk about them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Guy Hobbs. Those are very consistent with the recommendations that will be included in the final report. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, that final report hasn't been fully prepared, and as council read through that information, number 7 referred to a series of sub-recommendations regarding property and sales tax. Those are still in development at this point.
Okay. All right. So stay there for just a second. I'm going to have Mr. Killian. Can you discuss these issues, if there's any legal issues that we need to be aware of as if we make a decision to do some of this? And so if you would chime in on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Asher Killian, Committee Counsel. So just a couple of the recommendations that I wanted to touch on that are covered by existing law. So the first recommendation about extending the life of the commission to continue its work, I would just mention that NRS 387-1246, which is the section of law that creates the commission, is permanent. There is no sunset or expiration date on that section, so the commission does exist permanently as a body. So no action by the legislature would be necessary to extend the life of the commission, as it's already a permanent body. Subsection 10 of that section does provide that the commission meets only between July 1st of an odd-numbered year and September 30th of the subsequent even-numbered year. You may recall at the work session for this committee at its last meeting, the committee approved an item to revise that language to allow for the commission to meet outside of those dates at the call of the chair of either Education Committee or Money Committee of the legislature. For the second recommendation regarding maintenance of the model that drives the pupil-centered funding plan, I would just note that NRS 387-12463 requires the Commission to provide guidance to school districts and the Department of Education on the implementation of the PCFP, and on an ongoing basis to monitor the implementation of the PCFP and make any recommendations to the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Education that the Commission determines is necessary. So to the extent that maintaining the model for the PCFP is recommended to be a joint responsibility of the department and the Commission already has the responsibility by law to provide that kind of guidance and monitor the implementation of the PCFP. I believe part of the impetus behind both of those recommendations might be that the Commission feels additional resources are necessary to fully discharge those duties. That's not so much something that's typically done by a policy committee as a BDR request, but more usually done through the budget closing process in identifying what resources are necessary to discharge the duties assigned to a state entity by law. So it's probably not appropriate for this committee to be working through that, but it might be better served for that to be worked through the budget closing process during session to make sure the CSF has the resources necessary to carry out those duties. And then finally, for the 8th recommendation regarding state general fund appropriations, as Mr. Hobb noted, existing law requires the governor, and it's NRS 387-12455, existing law requires the governor to identify an amount of money to be transferred from the general fund to the state education fund for implementation of the PCFP, unless the governor finds that amount to be unpracticable. The amount that's required to be transferred is kind of a 3-tiered process. If the growth in the state general fund, as forecasted by the Economic Forum, will exceed the combined rate of growth in enrollment and the rate of inflation, then the governor is required to request a transfer of general funds at that higher rate into the state education fund to fund the PCFP. If the Economic Forum projects that the growth in the general fund will be less than the combined rate of inflation and growth of enrollment, then the governor is required to request at least an amount for the combined rate of inflation and growth of enrollment to be transferred from the general fund to the state education fund. And then the third tier is if the Economic Forum projects that the revenue in the general fund will decrease then the governor must recommend at least the same amount of money be transferred from the general fund to the state education fund as was transferred in the preceding biennium. And so my only note there is that that is a provision of existing law, and it sounds like the commission's recommendation is simply that the governor find it practicable to comply with existing law. So no action by the committee would be required to implement that recommendation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. Anything there that came up in his analysis that you wanted to comment on?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Guy Hobbs once again. In the continuation of the Commission on School Funding, yes, we do, I suppose, have the ongoing responsibility of improving the implementation of the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. I think it would be helpful, and I don't know the answer to this question at this moment, but would be happy to work on it if the Commission were tasked with further deliverables by the legislature over each interim during which it's allowed to meet. I think, over the next interim, for example, continuation of development of funding strategies would be an example of that type of direction.
Okay, and I just want to, I guess I want to clarify for the record, in the recommendation, the first recommendation, you're recommending that the commission be allowed to continue for what Mr. Killian just told us, that's already in statute. So is there a discrepancy in that some other interpretation that you feel or that you have? Or maybe it's the department, because I had heard that maybe the department had brought up that issue that the commission would be done and then would no longer be in existence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Guy Hobbs. I think what your legal counsel indicated to you, all of that is absolutely correct. I suppose that some of it came from feelings on the part of some members of the commission that largely its work had maybe been completed, at least its initial tasks, and therefore some may find it not necessary to have the commission continue. That was more speculation on their part. It's not something that was necessarily covered by the law.
Okay, so as far as that issue, so the way I'm looking at these recommendations is that we really don't need to do anything on the first one and second one because that's already in state law, so that's really only there's a funding issue that would be the normal budget process. So the recommendation would be to make sure that's funded properly, and then. On the, let's see, there were several of these that I think were recommendations that I think interpret as being recommendations for further study, like the revenue, which would probably be appropriate to maybe that would be more appropriate, like in a letter to the revenue committees to do, to take a look at that as opposed to in the education committee. The performance assessment, yeah.
Performance assessment.
And that would be another one that would need some type of study to be able to come up with that. So there's some things here that we could recommend to do. I think the one issue of establishing, what did I write down? Target values. I think that one might be problematic. Because of the issue of that's an ongoing thing that we can't tie the hands of future legislatures. However, that would be a really good way to set that target, right? So I don't know. There's a whole lot that we can do there in that particular recommendation. Okay. Thank you very much. So I guess the question I have, and first of all, any questions that you have for Mr. Hobbs or for Mr. Killian or for Mr. Okay, thank you very much. So the question I would then have is, do we have any additional recommendations that we wish to make from this committee as we move forward when it comes in respect to the commission? I mean, do we want to recommend that these studies be done? So that, okay, and so, okay, so let's, I'm going to have Ms. Sturm kind of individually come up with what the studies are and who we are recommending do the study. Because that's, I mean, we need to figure that out. If we're going to make a recommendation, we need to figure out who's going to do that. So if you will, let's just go through these one at a time. Sure. Maybe it'd be better to have Mr. Killian do it. That would you remind us which one of these would be appropriate for would be more appropriate to do as a study?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Asher Killian, Committee Counsel. So yes, I believe items 4 through 7 of these recommendations could each be appropriately addressed as a study. So item number 4 was the recommendation for the creation of a pathway for smaller school districts to acquire capital and engage in building improvement and modernization programs. This could be accomplished either as a study for the Interim Education Committee or for the Commission on School Funding in the fall interim that will follow this legislative session. Item number 5 was a recommendation.
Okay, hold on one second. Rather than have you go, let's just do these one at a time so that we don't have to come back. So this particular one was basically, I think he referenced the infrastructure bank, how it works, and so making capital available, especially he pointed out some of the rurals are already at their max, so they really don't have the ability to be able to, build a new facility. Is that correct, Mr. Killian?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Great. So, so is that something that we want to recommend to do a study of? And if so, do we want the Interim Committee on Education to do that, or have the Commission on School Funding do that? Well, first let's decide, is this something we want to recommend? Any comments? Okay, so,
Do you want me to say that?
yeah, Senator Dondarelli.
Thank you. My recommendation would be that most of these go to the commission, and so that they can continue their work, because it's going to be very important we have consistency there, and they are already started on that trajectory, in my opinion.
So since we're doing these one at a time, because one of these is probably more appropriate for the Revenue Committee, I think, when we get to that. But so on this specific one, it has to do with infrastructure and capital needs. Are you suggesting?
I would suggest that this go to the commission.
So you're suggesting that we make a recommendation and that would go to the commission?
Correct.
Okay. Any comments? Yes. So Vice Chair Dondarelli.
I would make a motion that the recommendation that we just discussed is studied by the Commission on School Funding.
I'll second that.
Just one, so we have a motion by Vice Chair Dondarelli, second by Senator
Bilbray.
Sorry. Okay, we have a motion by Vice Chair Bilbray Axelrod, second by Senator Dondarelli. On discussion, if we recommend the commission do this, then we're going to have to also provide some funding for them to do the study, I would imagine. So just as part of as we talk about these, that we do that, which I still think is appropriate, but we just need to make sure that's part of the recommendation. Otherwise, we're asking them to do it, and then they don't have the ability to do it. Further discussion on the motion? Okay, all in favor say aye. Aye. Or raise your hand. Or any opposed say nay. Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Killian, if you go to the next one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Asher Killian, Committee Counsel. So recommendation number 5 also appeared to be one that was appropriate for an issue to study, and that was the recommendation for the creation of performance metrics to assess the impact of enhanced investment in K-12 education. This is one that appears to be appropriate either for the Interim Committee on Education or for the Commission on School Funding to generate those recommendations for. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so on this one, discussion. Vice Chair Bilbray Axelrod.
If it's appropriate, I would like to, once again, have the Commission on School Funding work on this study as well.
Okay. Any other discussion? All right, so do you want to
I
make a
would
motion?
make that motion.
Okay, we have a motion from Vice Chair Bilbray Axelrod.
Second.
Second from Senator John Darrell Loop. Further discussion on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Raise your hand. Any opposed say nay. Motion carries. All right, let's go to the next one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Asher Killian, Committee Counsel. So the next item that seemed to be appropriate for a study was recommendation number 6, which was a recommendation for the legislature to study the imbalance between the number of professional educators matriculating from institutions of higher education in the state and the number of new units of professional educators demanded each year by school districts in the state, as well as issues relating to classification and compensation of educators and support personnel and certain related issues. This is another item that it appears would be appropriate either for the Interim Committee on Education to study or for the Commission on School Funding to further study. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, discussion? Is this something we want to recommend? Okay, Vice Chair Bilbray Axelrod, did you have a comment?
Well, I think they should be doing,
Okay.
that's my opinion.
Senator John Darrell Loop.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I sort of said this at the beginning, that I think they should be doing them all because of the consistency, in my opinion. While I recognize some of these may be able to fit in both areas, maybe an interim study or an interim committee versus Commission on School Funding, I just feel like the continuation of the school funding information model, the people working on it, everything involved, I feel like is a really good balance, and I think that they need to continue this work.
Okay. Assemblyman Bilbray Axelrod.
That I would move to have the Commission on School Funding work on this issue as well.
Okay, we have a
My
motion. We have a motion from Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod, second from Senator Don Darrell Loop. Any further discussion on the motion? Okay, all in favor say aye, or raise your hand. Any opposed say nay. Okay, motion carries. All right. Mr. Killian, is your...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the final item recommended that appeared to be appropriate for a study was recommendation number 7, which was to consider modernization of both the Nevada sales and use tax and property tax systems as primary and traditional funding sources for state services and K-12 education. Capacity exists within both of these systems of taxation to fund the recommended increase in funding for K-12 education. So this is an item that it would appear to be appropriate either for the Commission to further study or for the Interim Committee on Revenue to further study. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So discussion on this one. Mr. Killian recommend, well, he suggested that it could be done by either revenue or it could be done by the commission. Any Discussion? Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod.
I actually think this is more appropriate that the Revenue Committee, that we give this information to the Revenue Committee on the Assembly side for sure, because that's what we call it, as revenue. But I think that's the appropriate place to deal with this, with the information that Mr. Hobbs has presented and the School Funding Commission.
Okay, other discussion? I would, I think either one could do this. I think the benefit I would see to having revenue do it is that you have another group of legislators that would look at these issues. I mean, the way he lined it out today, I don't know that we've ever really discussed it that way in revenue. And I think it might be helpful to have someone else, understand that, and that as we go through that process. But I mean, that would be my suggestion. But any other comments or preferences as far as who would do that? Senator Dondarello.
Just as another thought on that, we have got a really short timeline before we start our session in February. I see this as something, once again, and it's not taking it away from the legislature, it's giving it to another body that is continuing this work and can work hand in hand with the legislature. So I would still lean a little bit on the school funding side, I think. And the other clarification is these are just recommendations. So at any point, that recommendation could actually change. But that my suggestion would still be the School Funding Commission or the Commission on School Funding, just because of the magnitude of the discussion.
Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That actually, it just occurred to me, and maybe Mr. Killing could clarify, if we did hand it over to Revenue, by what we have, what our recommendation was that we could call up the Commission on School Funding, but if we turn it over to Revenue, that's not something that they could do. They could not call them to work on the issue. So that would be my concern.
Okay, Mr. Killian, did you understand the comment or the question, whether if the Revenue Committee was working on this, would they even be able to work with the Commission since they've already done the preliminary work on this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Asher Killian, Committee Counsel. So I'll preface this answer by just saying that under existing law, the Commission on School Funding cannot meet again. Since we've passed September 30th of the even-numbered year, the Commission on School Funding cannot meet again until after the 2023 legislative session. This committee did request a bill draft to allow them to meet on call of the Chair of Education or Money, but that's not law yet, and that wouldn't become law until obviously after the 23 session starts. So if this were a matter that were committed to the Interim Revenue Committee during the 23 to 25 biennium, based on the request of this committee earlier that the chairs of Education and Money be able to call the CSF into session, it would not be a thing that the revenue chairs could call CSF into session for, but you could make it part of that request to allow the revenue chairs to call CSF into session for this particular matter, in addition to the standing power for the chairs of Education and Money to call CSF into session.
So we could pass it and approve it in 2 days.
Okay, so motion then? Sounds like we want to do something, so it's just whether we want Commission or Revenue to do that. The way I look at this is they're going to do a study and come back with some recommendations. So at some point, if we have the commission do it, they can probably really do a really good job, and then the recommendations eventually would have to go to revenue in the next session or whatever. So either way, I mean, they're both going to look at this at one way or another. So do we have yes, Vice Chair Bilber Axelrod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Then I would make the motion to once again give this back to the Commission on School Funding.
Okay, all right.
That's my motion.
Thank you. So we have a motion and a second from Senator Don Darrell Loop. Any further discussion on the motion? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay. All right, motion passes. Okay, does that cover all? So these recommendations to be included in the recommendations that we're already doing for the commission. Is that correct?
Yeah. 4, 5, 6, and 7.
4, 5, 6, and 7. Yeah. So these are to have it studied. 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then my understanding was that Mr. Killian made it clear that the commission continues. I mean, it's not being discontinued, and so somehow I think that somebody has an interpretation that's different than what actual law is there. So I just want to make sure that was clear for the record, that the commission continues on, and the funding part has to go through the budget process to make sure that they have the funding to be able to do not only their work, but now we're asking them to do these additional studies that they could have done. Okay, so I don't see any other action items. Ms. Sturm, does that cover all the actionable items that we might need to vote on?
Jen Sturm, Community Policy Analyst. That's all I had noted for this item.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Killian, for your help on that. All right, so that completes that item. Let's go on to our next item, which is the presentation on the findings and recommendations concerning the study of instruction relating to the Holocaust and other genocides. And we have, I believe, Chair Elliot Malin here in Las Vegas, Dave Brandkamp from the Nevada Department of Education, and Janie Malorny from the Nevada Department of Education. So I don't know how you guys want to do that, but whoever's going to speak first, go ahead. When you're ready, go ahead.
Hello, good morning. I'm Janie Maloney for the record. Thank you, Chair and committee members, for allowing us to present some findings over our subcommittee on the Holocaust and other genocides. My counterpart, who was up north, Director Dave Brandkamp, had to actually leave. He's triple booked today, so he had to run back to the 5th Street office to present on regulations. So we're trying to be in more places with less people, I guess. We are here presenting. I am here myself. I am Jane Malorny. I am an education program professional with the Department of Education, and I staff this subcommittee, and I'm with our chair, Elia Mahan, and he will be presenting as well with me. Just to refresh our memory, the subcommittee was created through AB 231, which does require the State Board of Education to appoint a subcommittee to review and make recommendations on the manner in which to provide certain information to pupils concerning the Holocaust and other genocides, such as Armenian, Cambodian, Darfur, Guatemalan, and Rwandan genocides. Additionally, we are to review the manner in which certain standards support comprehensive education on Holocaust for educators and students, including resources and professional learning. AB 231 specified members to be on the subcommittee, and you can see who represents the different entities that are on this subcommittee. So we do have representation from the department, from the state board, members from the Governor's Advisory Council on Education for Relating to the Holocaust, We have representation from nonprofit organizations in working with Holocaust and with other genocides. We also have individuals who are educators, one educator from a school district that is smaller than 60,000, one educator that is larger, a district that has more than 60,000 students. We also have a charter school representative. And then we have representatives from nonprofits who work in really arenas that provide a lot of resources and support in other genocides. The subcommittee itself was really asked to explore, and we broke it down into these 4 questions. So one is, what is occurring in Holocaust and other genocides instruction? So what's already occurring right now in our classrooms? What could be enhanced? What are things that we know that maybe isn't happening, or things that we need to do to ensure it is happening? And then what are recommendations that the subcommittee want to offer to the State Board of Education and Department of Education relating to resources and professional learning? And then lastly, are there any legislative recommendations that do need to be considered? To kind of review of what has been happening in Nevada, you can see what has been happening currently relating to professional learning, as well as in what was planned for this year. So in working with Nevada Department of Education, multiple organizations around our state and the local school districts, you can kind of see what has been happening. So we do offer face-to-face events. There's been one in Washoe and one in Clark County. And since COVID, we have increased to a virtual event that does include all districts and charter schools from around the state. There's been multiple professional learning opportunities made by multiple different nonprofit and other organizations through Echoes and Reflection, through the LA Museum, the Tolerance Museum in LA that really does have a vast amount of resources relating to the Holocaust, as well as Illinois Holocaust Museum and the PBS modules that are offered within our state that really help provide resources, content, and professional learning for our educators. For the last few years, UNLV has hosted a panel on Holocaust education, and then there has been district-specific professional learning opportunities that our state has offered. The one thing that I would say is in addition to this upcoming year, you can see that they're very, very similar, is that we will have the face-to-face event, and this is an actual student-teacher conference, so students come as well as teachers come in both Clark County and in Washoe County. And we are also adding what we're calling the Holocaust Traveling Tour. And so this is where there will be members, myself included, that we're actually going to go to 3 districts a year and provide in-house learning for students and then professional learning for educators. So some of our smaller districts have a harder time accessing professional learning and getting face-to-face events as well as our students. So we're going to bring it to them. This is actually funded through the Governor's Council on education relating to the Holocaust, and they have actually helped supported this to just help some of the traveling for our experts to be able to go provide this learning for both students and teachers. One of the other things the subcommittee put forth was a survey, a needs assessment survey, to say what are we missing? What do we still need to do in our classrooms? The survey was open for roughly 30 days. We had over 100 educators participate. Would we have liked to see more? Absolutely. But we did get over 100. And some of the summary that we pulled from the results was that our teachers responded that they understand Holocaust and they understand teaching the Holocaust, but they definitely needed more support in the other genocides. It wasn't clear to them what resources they should be using on how to teach it and how to teach it appropriately. The second one, which was interesting to us, is they actually said they wanted mandatory training. So they believed that instead of it being optional, they believed that educators should be actually told to take training around Holocaust and other genocides. Mostly because this leads into the third one, is that our teachers might have the resources to teach it, but they don't understand the methodology behind teaching Holocaust and other genocides. It is a controversial topic. It is difficult to talk about in classrooms with kids. And so some of our teachers don't feel equipped with the strategies in order to teach us effectively and appropriately without being disrespectful. And so those were the really high needs. Chair Mahan is going to talk about the recommendations.
this is far. Elliot Mallon for the record, chair of the subcommittee on Holocaust and other genocides, and I want to emphasize the rest of this, such as the Armenian, Cambodian, Darfur, Guatemalan, and Rwandan genocides. And I wanted to emphasize that because something we did see from that really fast was while teachers and educators in Nevada are largely confident on the Holocaust, we saw a lot of responses also that were about conflicts that weren't genocide. Within the statute, within AB 231, we included a definition for genocide from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. On the other side of that is a lot of the responses were only about the Holocaust. And while the Holocaust is important to me, and the big reason why we brought the legislation in the first place, we did put an emphasis on bringing others to the table to make sure that their stories were told. So Nevada's educators, what we saw also was that they need the resources and the professional development on genocide education. What they want to see, what they want is the knowledge base and the resources and the tools to make them successful in the classroom to help them teach these to their students. So the recommendations from the subcommittee was to build a system-wide support for all educators, families, and students. We wanted to develop a crosswalk of English language arts, fine arts, and social studies standards that address the Holocaust and these other genocides. One thing we noticed is that Holocaust and genocide education is not just social studies. It can be art. It can be English literature. Oftentimes, teachers are assigning the novel Night. It could be film. It could be cinematic arts. We are seeing some teachers utilize these resources in their classrooms as well. Anecdotally here, growing up in Las Vegas as a student in Clark County School District, we watched The Devil's Arithmetic in class. And so they're looking for these resources to be brought together and to be cross-disciplinary. They want us to curate those resources for the educators on Holocaust and other genocides and host that on a website and statewide LMS or Canvas. They want us to work collaboratively with the Governor's Advisory Council on education relating to the Holocaust. We have these resources here in state, but that Advisory Council also has a $100,000 budget, and that gets stretched pretty thin. They also wanted us to develop on-demand professional learning modules and maintain that on Canvas as well, and to develop and support a professional learning network for educators. So our recommendations from the subcommittee was one, funding for a Holocaust and other genocides professional position at the Department of Education, and funding to the Department of Education to develop professional learning and curate resources for educators in Nevada on the Holocaust and these other genocides, as well as funding for the school districts and charter schools to support substitute teacher coverage for teachers and administrators to participate in professional learning during contract hours. And that gets us to another issue that we saw, was that a lot of teachers are not able to take the time to go and learn and professionally develop because they're not being paid to go and do so. And that is our recommendations. And this was important to us because, again, it gets to the root of what we're trying to do. And that's further Holocaust and other genocide education in the state of Nevada. And I want to reiterate that those other genocides, again, are the Armenian, Cambodian, Darfur, Guatemalan, and Rwandan genocides. And it's not limited to that. While, again, many of you know me, the Holocaust is important to me personally. My story isn't the only one here in Nevada. And our residents, Nevadans, deserve to have their stories told and taught. And those are our recommendations.
Questions? Yes, Assemblywoman Thomas.
And thank you for this much-needed presentation. I just have one question. On slide 8, you had indicated bringing others to the table. I wanted to know who were the others, if you could specify.
Thank you for the question. Jenny Maloney again for the record. Addressing the individuals and stakeholders around particularly the other genocides that we had mentioned. So making sure that their voices are heard. So really honoring and capturing thoughts around Cambodian and Darfur and Armenian, and it not just be solely on Holocaust. And so those were the aspects that we really wanted to pay, I would say, more attention to. And our teachers had indicated the same, is that they seem to have more resources and understand teaching the Holocaust, I would say better, because they probably have been teaching it longer versus really calling out and addressing those other genocides.
Elliot Mallon for the record, and if I can follow that up really quickly. And I keep putting the stress and the emphasis on these other genocides because I think that's important. Our mission was not to just look at the Holocaust, but it's to make sure that the Nevadans' voices of one are heard, these stories are taught, and our students are taught these lessons that help them become better citizens over time. And that mission was taken very seriously by the subcommittee. It's a conversation we had at our last subcommittee meeting last week when we were making these recommendations on who should be at this table. And it's making sure that it's not just me coming from the Jewish community, but it's bringing the Armenian community to the table. It's bringing the Guatemalan community to the table, the Cambodian community, the Darfurian community to the table, and making sure that their stories are taught and that all the recognized genocides, again, we have a definition for that, that they have a chance to have that story told.
Thank you. And would that include, pardon me for not understanding completely, would that include our African community also?
Elliot Mallon for the record. Are we talking about African as in African genocides or domestic United States?
Genocides.
Then yes.
Okay, thank you. And just a follow-up, Chair, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Will this one person that would be on this committee, would that person be knowledgeable in all aspects of genociding as far as different countries, ethnic races?
Elliot Mallon for the record. The intent here is to place this position within the Department of Education as a funded position. And within that funding is that we have the resources to make sure that they are able to include these groups, these genocides, these historical events, and bring all of the resources together for our teachers, our educators, and then give them those resources, not just the physical paper, but also the professional development.
Understood. Thank you so much. I respect the clarification. Thank you.
I just want to understand part of the question you just answered. She asked about African genocide. The bill was real specific in the genocides. Is that so? It's not. It doesn't include all genocides that have occurred, right?
Elliot Mallon for the record. It includes all genocides that meet the definition from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The ones that we list are not all inclusive.
Okay.
They're examples of genocides that we want to make sure that we are looking at. And we did bring up Darfur, and I believe we even had Rwandan purposely on there because it's not, again, it's not just the Holocaust. That's not the only genocide here. Genocide is, we have a long history of it within our world, and we want to make sure that all of those stories are told.
Perfect. I just wanted it to be clear because even though you give examples, that there is a definition. So. Great. Any other discussion? Yes, Senator Dondarelou.
Thank you very much for the presentation. When you talked about the support instruction and that the teachers lacked all those strategies and resources, where are we in the preparation or the, I guess, the preparation of those resources for teachers?
Elliot Mallon for the record. So one thing we saw is that we do have a lot of these resources out there. And a lot of those voices are encapsulated on this subcommittee. What we're trying to do is bring everything together. So we don't, our purview was not to bring this together within the subcommittee, it was to make this recommendation. And while these resources are here in the state, there's no one particularly right now bringing it all together for our teachers and our educators. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, so we could make some, we have the ability, we do have a BDR if we want to make any recommendations. We don't have to do a BDR. If we just want to do like we did with some of the other stuff and send a letter to different departments or to the finance committee. The recommendations that they made call for funding education programs at the Department of Ed, and also professional development and support for student substitute teacher coverage. So those would probably be, they wouldn't be in a BDR format because it would be part of the budget process. So I would think that would be a letter from us going to like the governor's office, maybe copying the Department of Ed and maybe to the finance committees. I don't know. Your thoughts? Okay, so Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's those darn hyphenated names. We get you. Yes, my recommendation would be to do exactly what you said, to send a letter to the governor's office. So this would be included in the budget for these items that were recommended by the subcommittee. So that would be my motion.
And would that also include the money committees?
Yes, I'm sorry.
And then copied to the department?
And copied also to both money committees. Thank you.
And the Department of Ed.
And the Department of Education.
And Senator Darrell Loop, you want a second?
Second.
All right, we have a second from Senator Darrell Loop. Any further discussion on the motion? All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say nay. Okay, motion carries. Thank you very much. Great report and great work that you're doing, and hopefully we can get you some help to do some of these things that have been identified. Thank you. All right. Okay, let's go to our next item on the agenda, which is public comment, item number 6. Just as a reminder, we're limiting public comment to 2 minutes per person, and you can also submit public comments. Do we have anybody here in Las Vegas who wish to make public comment? I don't see anybody coming forward. Do we have anyone in Carson City?
It doesn't appear so, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. We do have somebody here. She'll come forward. Also, while she's coming forward, anyone that wishing to give, if you haven't had an opportunity yet to giving comment via online, you can do that. And I'm going to ask BPS about that in a minute, but just want to give you a heads up since there's kind of a little bit of a delay when they hear it from when I say it, so online. So welcome. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. Lena Hovanessian, as a stakeholder on behalf of the Armenian community here in Nevada, and also as a representative of the Armenian National Committee of America, Nevada co-chair. I want to say thank you to Janie Maloney and Elliot Mallon for their work, and the subcommittee, as well as the the individuals who are on that subcommittee. And thank you too, as well, to the Education Committee for the tremendous support. And I just wanted to identify additional resources that are available, such as Kurt Krikorian, who was a titan here in the state of Nevada. One of his legacy projects was the Promise film, which was about the Armenian genocide, which would be a tremendous resource that we could discuss, with the subcommittee, as well as Ani Hovanessian's film, The Hidden Map, which was on PBS recently here in Nevada as well. So there are tremendous resources that could be used, as teaching tools in film, and also other genocide education curricula, which have been developed by the Armenian community nationwide. So I definitely appreciate the inclusion both in the bill and ongoing through the implementation of other genocides, and especially the Armenian genocide, which was the first genocide of the modern era. So thank you again to the Education Subcommittee and to the chair.
Thank you very much. Anyone else here in Las Vegas? Okay, let's go to BPS. BPS, do we have anyone online wishing to give public comment?
Thank you, Chair Dennis. The public line is open and working. However, there are no callers at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the members and everyone who presented to the committee today and all the work that went forth to be able to do that. An archived version of today's meeting will be available online. This being our final meeting, I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to the committee members, stakeholders, and presenters who gave generously of their time and expertise over the last 11 meetings. Thank you also to the Legislative Council Bureau staff that support the committee, the individuals who in broadcast and production services, fiscal, legal, and research. We have an amazing staff, and they've done an amazing job this interim as we've gone through the various committees and talked about a lot of issues that are important in education that we need to make sure that we can address those issues so that we can improve achievement and really make a difference in the lives of the children here in Nevada. And I think I kind of shared this last time, but I just want to, since it's my last official meeting with education, I'd like to just say that it's been an honor to serve as chair. I know I've had an opportunity before, but we've really done a lot of great work, and the committee members are amazing, and I know you've got a lot of work ahead of you, and hopefully you're better prepared as you go into session with the things that we've been able to study and hear over the last over this interim. And thanks again for the service that you give, and I know that we've done some great things for education, and we've got more things to do, and you'll have an opportunity to do that. So thank you for this opportunity to allow me to chair this committee. I mentioned this at the beginning. Of all the committee members, I'm the only male in a committee full of some amazing women, and I know that there's some amazing work that's coming forth from you. So thank you for that. Any additional comments before I, Senator Dondero?
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to take the time to thank you publicly for your time and your expertise and your gift to this state, because you have been a long-standing committee member, and that's really important to have the institutional knowledge. I know that sometimes in this job people think they want to change, but lest we never forget the history of what has happened before us. And so thank you very much. And I think that you've always been the male in a lot of women, because you also were the PTA president and encouraged men to get involved. So thank you very much, and we so appreciate you, and you will be missed.
Thank you. Vice Chair Bilberry Axelrod.
Thank you, and I ditto that from my colleague, Dondero Loop. But I just wanted to say, as someone who came into this committee as chair, during session, I just really appreciated your very open door policy. I have learned in my 3 terms that not every chair is like that. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you involving me in everything, even in the interim as well. So you've become quite a mentor, and big shoes to fill for whoever takes over the Senate Education Committee, but I look forward to working with them. So we'll miss you.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Thomas.
Yes, just for the record, I wanted to ditto both the Senator and Assemblywoman Vice Chair, what they had to say about you. You know, you and I have a long-standing relationship, and I appreciate your guidance over the years as far as education is concerned. And I appreciate being on this interim committee for education, and you've been an excellent chair. And I must say, during conversation during some combative moments that we've had here. You have been an excellent chair with governing your chairmanship. So thank you so much for all you do for our community.
Thank you very much. Just for the record, our daughters are best friends since high school, so we knew each other before the legislature. So, all right. With that, actually, Senator Don Darrell Loop just reminded me of a story I used to tell. I got involved in the legislature because of my involvement in PTA. I walked into a kindergarten classroom 30 plus years ago, and volunteered to get involved. And so I became the president at a local school at C.C. Arano Elementary School. And after I had served I think I'd served 2 terms. I think it was 2 years or 4 years, whatever it was. My wife decided to run for PTA, and my kids, the kids at the school and my kids said, "You mean a woman can run for PTA president?" Oh. And so I always thought that was the fact that they got to see different role models in different things that they can do things. And hopefully, the things that we do are really making a difference in the lives of children. That's why I got involved. I wanted to make it better for my daughter, but realized that we really have to help all of Nevada's kids if we really want to make a difference for our future and for our children and their future. So anyways, thank you for that. With that, we have no further items to come before us at this time, so we are adjourned.